Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning Live. I'm your host, Aaron Tomlinson. I'm just going to make sure this is playing all the places I want it to. So give me just a second. Hope everybody out there is doing well. Had a good 4th of July. If you choose to celebrate it, make sure I get this up in the group. All right. So last week, I just kind of thought out loud with everybody, shared some of my thoughts about where I think the future of spirituality, the future of religion is going. And I thought it would be a good idea to bring in a better mind. So I want to introduce you today to my friend, Jeff Turner. You're going to love him if you've not heard him or followed his stuff. Just a brilliant guy, very well read, very articulate. So I'm really looking forward to having this discussion. So without any further ado with that, I'm going to bring Jeff on. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, happy Sunday, man. Good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise. How are you doing?
I'm good. As we were saying behind the scenes before the show started, I'm a little tired this morning, and I know you are too. So
yeah.
Looking at yourself in the camera whenever you're live streaming and being like, oh man. But oh well.
Yeah.
I'm here and I'm glad to be here with you, man.
I know that took so much getting used to when I started doing this stuff, was just seeing myself and basically talking to myself. And I don't know about you. I always do better with a live audience.
For sure.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for coming on, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Really looking forward to having this conversation. I've been on a couple podcasts with you. You're a former pastor. I'll let you talk about yourself in a minute, but you're a former pastor. You also are currently, you do a lot of stuff. But one of the things you do is host, let's see if I get this right, Soul School Sojourn with Andrea Perry. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's a tongue twister, man. Say that fast 15 times.
Yeah. But our preacher days, we know how to alliterate, right? So we can do that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah. Well, for one, it's really an honor to be here with you this morning. And I really appreciate you. I appreciate the work you do. I appreciate your mind. I appreciate your openness with your own spiritual journey and just everything that you've done and shared. I really appreciate it. So it's an honor to be here this morning. But my name's Jeff Turner. For those of you who don't know, some of you may know me, some of you may not. I am a former pastor. I was a pastor for about 12 years in the Assemblies of God. And let's see, I became heavily involved in what was called the Grace Finished Works movement, I don't know, a decade and a half ago, and was very active in that, and still to some extent am, and have no problem identifying with those people as well. A lot of my really dear friends are still very much a part of that movement. Became more part of what's been called the deconstruction movement kind of after that, mostly because grace afforded me the opportunity to ask questions that I did not have the opportunity to ask before, because I was basically afraid of what would happen if I did. So when I kind of didn't have that fear hanging over my head like a sort of Damocles, I could ask those questions, right? And then when I asked them, some things kind of fell apart on me and never quite went back together, because I don't think they're supposed to. And so I found myself for a season, and we can talk more about this, but just brief overview. For a season, whilst pastoring, I found myself, for all suits and purposes, an atheist, and it's one of those things that in retrospect, you're like, how literal of an atheist was I? And I don't know. At the time, it felt like full on. Now, in retrospect, I kind of realized that the whole journey, you're being held together by the same force, whatever one wants to call that. So in the aftermath, I experienced that experience differently, but that was the experience I passed through. These days, I'm working still as an author, still as a speaker, speaking in churches and things like that when the opportunities present themselves. I also work a bit in the paranormal community now, which is what you were referencing when you spoke of the show I host with Andrea Perrin. Andrea Perrin, for those who might not know, she's the eldest daughter of the family whose story the movie The Conjuring is based on. And so she wrote the books that sort of influenced all of that. Very well known in that world. And she and I providentially connected over COVID. And so she ended up asking me to host a show with her. So we do that. And that's live every Friday night. And basically what we do there is we just kind of explore the intersection of different forms of spirituality. You know, I still come at things. I come at things from a mystical Christian perspective, I suppose you could say. That definitely still colors my thought and my language. It's like my native tongue, I always say. So I definitely always speak in that, even if I'm not always meaning what it might sound like I'm meaning. And she is more from, she's a former Catholic, but she's kind of more, metaphysics, all that goes with having grown up in an extremely haunted house that becomes one of the most famous horror franchises on the planet. She kind of has a spiritual perspective that goes along with all of that. And so we have some great conversations, and you've been on there several times. You've probably been on there with me 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
Because Andrea is she's a paranormal celebrity. So she's always getting whisked off to some paracon somewhere or to film for this, that, or the other. And you've always been a really willing, even last minute guest. And we've had some incredible conversations on there. And I've always heard great feedback from people when we've had them. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing now. Got several books that I'm working on. One of which I'll probably hit on some of the subject matter of it today, just judging by where the conversation seems like it's probably going to go. And so, yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of who I am and what I do. I'm also a husband and a father of 3, which is the most important thing. Got to say that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, so really excited to have you on. So it's interesting as we've gotten to know each other a little bit more and had conversations and stuff. It's really interesting to me how much similarities there are. I mean, we know some of the same people from when we were pastoring, operated in some of the same circles and same movements. You went into atheism, I would say pretty strongly for a minute.
Yeah.
And then you have this experience with the paranormal, which is why I thought you'd be the perfect guest to bring on to have this conversation. So my journey, I think what's interesting about my journey was I didn't grow up in a fundamentalist environment at all. We were Methodists. We went to church on Sundays and for an hour. And if the preacher spoke over, 2 minutes over an hour, the board would have a meeting that night with him to straighten him out. And we said grace, before meals and prayers before bedtime. That was about it. My mom read me some Bible stories, when I was younger. So then I came into the charismatic movement. Actually, I came into the charismatic movement after I got filled with the Spirit, speaking in tongues and stuff like that, just out of desperation. A really traumatic experience when I was 16 years old with my family that just kind of shattered everything for us. And so I was just really deeply searching for something, looking for something. So I didn't go through this transition of like really harsh legalism, which I would say from my perspective, Assembly of God is about the most mainstream of harsh fundamentalism. There are worse groups out there.
Definitely lends itself to that at the very least.
Yeah. I mean, my experience with it here, for sure, we had some really hardcore, very legalistic, very old school Pentecostal pastors that led the Assembly of God churches in my area and stuff like that. So that was my exposure to that. So I never really I always felt like I preached grace and that kind of stuff, but I really made a hard push for the supernatural from the very beginning. I remember going away and fasting for 3 days and praying, and someone gave me a set of John Wimber's Doing the Stuff cassette tape. And I just devoured those over the, that 3-day time period and did a lot of praying, like I said, fasting, and then kind of took off from there with a lot of gifts of the Spirit and things like that. And was in a particular church that I had decided to attend where they didn't embrace that. They weren't against it, but they believed in it on paper, but they didn't like the idea of it actually happening. So we got the left foot of fellowship from them.
Yeah. I've felt that before.
So the supernatural was just very much a part of always of my Christian experience. I was just thinking back on it this last week about some of the crazy stuff and incredible stuff that happened. So for me to deconstruct was really shocking, as I'm sure it was in your family and circles. It was very shocking to myself. I kid around that if my past self could have seen my future self, I might have killed myself just to make sure I saved my salvation.
Yeah, right. God would have understood that more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like my past self would be just absolutely horrified with where my present self is at, if I could have seen. So it was a little bit harder for me, like the atheism route, it just didn't mesh for me. And I'm bringing this up for a reason because I didn't know where to go. So like I immediately I remember going to metaphysical fairs, holistic fairs. I remember the first time I went into a holistic fair and I was just like, okay, Lord, because I'm still kind of teetering on that middle ground sort of place. And I'm like, okay, you have to guide me. You have to protect me. I remember the first time I got a tarot card reading, I thought for sure I'm going to get a demon from this. And then I thought to myself, well, if I get a demon, I know people that can cast it out.
Yeah. You were prepared.
I was ready. I had all my, my mind does this, but in my family, we call it the Google search of doom, Go into any situation and you're just scrolling worst case scenarios.
Also called anxiety, right?
Yeah. So we actually did, we transitioned our church from like solely a Christian organization, charismatic church, into really more of a metaphysical type church and community. And I felt like that transition was going about as well as it could. And then the pandemic hit and the bottom fell out, and had lots more time on my hands to think through stuff, had some formidable challenges and arguments in favor of atheism that I had to address. If I wanted to be intellectually honest with myself, I had to address those things. But here's what I've seen. You mentioned deconstruction. Pre-show, we were talking a little bit. You mentioned religious trauma, helping people through religious trauma and stuff like that. And what I began to see was that there was kind of this progression of people from whatever version of Christianity to a more progressive version of Christianity, to flirting with, I guess, for lack of a better word, the paranormal and the metaphysical. And then almost everybody veered off into atheism, or full-blown atheism. And I think part of the reason for that, and I want to get your thoughts on this, but I think part of the reason for that is because it's very difficult. I think, you may think differently, I think it's very difficult to forge a path forward with spirituality, with mysticism, without all the religious baggage, or if you have religious trauma, without all the triggers. Like I know for me, the Bible was a trigger for a while. Not too long ago, I don't ever go out on Sunday mornings, and I just happened to have to meet somebody at my office building. And so I was out and around churches around 11, 12 o'clock on a Sunday, and it was stirring stuff up in me. So we have these sort of negative triggers that go with a lot of, some of us, with a lot of religion and religious stuff. So therefore, if we try to move forward in spirituality, we can get triggered with those things, or we can go off into things that maybe are too far out there for us. For a lot of people, crystals are too far out there. For some people, UFO, communing with aliens telepathically or whatever is too far out there. Bigfoot is too far out there. And so it's like there's no path.
Right.
And so that's something I've become very passionate about in the last year or so. Actually, I just let the audience know it was a word, Jeff, that you gave me last August. I don't know if you remember, but I was on the radio program with you, and you were talking about Jacob and Esau. And I don't remember all the details of it, but it shook me in a good way to say, okay, I need to recover my mystical self. I need to recover, that's part of authentically who I am.
Right.
And so for the last year or so, I've just been more passionate about how do we help people forge a pathway forward. So what are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about deconstruction, atheism? To me, it's like exchanging one philosophy of life for another philosophy of life, but sort of void of, for me, void of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to get your thoughts on any of that stuff. Anything you want to pick
Yeah.
up here to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to launch. There's a lot to jump off of and get into there, but
Probably too much.
no, we'll make it work. Well, I'll say one thing that definitely comes to mind when you say that is atheism. I think atheism and Western Christianity are essentially different ends of the same canoe, you know, and you can either capsize on one or you can capsize on the other, but you will. Because if you lean too far this way, you're going in the water. If you lean too far this way, you're going in the water. And I really think they are. And some people will just say that's just absolutely absurd. But one can't exist without the other. They're each of them lamp rays on the bottom of the shark, kind of parasitically living off of the other,
Yeah.
Christianity, in terms of it's, how it's more ancient. I think it's the pre-existing one. But either way, at this point, they're kind of interdependent on one another, and one will cease to exist without the other. But that said, it's also easy to switch from one to the other and really feel like you made a genuine switch, when in truth you really didn't. You're still in the same arena. You're still wearing jerseys and helmets and pads. You're playing the same game. You're just running this way instead of that way, and your jersey's this color instead of that color. And to us, that feels like, okay, well, now I'm really in opposition to what I was once for, but only on a certain level, because you're still playing the same game. And if the problem is the game, not the team, then you're still in the problem, right? And so
Such a great analogy. Wow.
Yeah, and if you've ever seen the movie The Truman Show, I always liken it onto, where there is that scene at the end where he's essentially fighting God, the creator, the producer of the show, who's kind of watching him from above. And he's instilled in him this fear of water, so that Truman, for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert, but the movie's like 2 decades old, so there's not too much grace with spoiler alerts at that point. But Jim Carrey plays a character who was raised his whole life basically on a reality show, and he was the only one who's not privy to the fact that it's a reality show, and it's all watching him. Everyone else is in on it. Anyways, he starts to suspect that something's wrong with his world in kind of a Matrix-like fashion, right? And so he starts to see behind the veil, and long story short, he wants to get out of there, but they've instilled in him a fear of water by creating different circumstances in his life that make him fear traveling off of the island he lives on, because he's terrified of water. And so he never does. Well, at the end, he kind of gets fed up, sees a little bit too much, and decides to go for it. And the creator of the show is basically stirring up these storms and everything, and basically trying to kill him almost, it seems like. Well, at the end of it all, it seems like he wins. It seems like he's defeated the system. Everything subsides, and he's laying on the boat, and everything's calm, and it's like, oh, he's free now. But then all of a sudden, his boat crashes into the open sky, and you realize that what you thought was open sky was just the end of the studio, massive though it was. And then you realize that even the sense of freedom he had in moving this way, he was still in the bubble, and the end of it is him leaving the studio. And I think most of us just never leave the studio. We fight the guy upstairs, and we feel like we're free just by moving this way, but we're really not. We're still contained in the same little sky dome, and freedom is leaving. And so that's one of the things, like in my last book, one of the things I tried to explore, what I called atheistic theism, was a type of encounter and experience of God that enters into what I call our projections of who God is as a projectile to sort of blow them up, and also free us from the delusion that by going this way or that way, we're doing anything other than just going in the same way, basically, right? Because if you go, you meet again, right? So, so that's one of the things that I tried to explore. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But also, one of the things you said is that, so atheism offers a certain structure. It's an anti-structure, right? But it is still a structure. But the difference is, with Christianity, even when you get rid of the structure, there is still like a heart at the center, which is the pursuit of the divine.
Right.
So there is, at the end of it, even if you get rid of the structure and you throw it all off, and I'm a spiritual but not religious person or whatever, there's always that ember of something that can represent hope you're going for. But atheism, when you get rid of the structure, there's nothing, right? And it could be human progress, it could be this, that, or the other, but if you reduce it down far enough, you're not really left with anything. So I don't think it's anything that really can provide us any kind of lasting meaning or structure. I just don't. I think that, well, anyone who's paying attention, the new atheism movement is going off the rails. it was really popular in the 2010s, early 2010s, post 9/11, gaining a lot of steam and a lot of traction. And there are some people who have hopped on in recent years and kind of reinvigorated a little bit, some of them coming from the deconstruction movement. So now there's people from the inside who are a part of this, and so that's kind of reinvigorated it a little bit. But it's so fractured and fragmented now because it's Protestant in nature, because it comes from Christianity, right? It's a reaction to Protestant Christianity, and Protestant Christianity has as its fractal core this continuous need to protest and fracture. So atheism does the same thing. So you see within atheism, you have you have a more conservative atheism, you have a more, left-wing atheism, you have an atheism that tends towards this, but it's doing the same thing. So there's been a little bit of, a shot in the arm given to it by some new people and new voices being ushered in, but I just don't ultimately see it going anywhere. So here's the deal then, that when it comes to the more like esoteric spirituality, like we were talking about, a more perennialist kind of view of things, where it's sort of that Blavatskyan bringing together of a lot of different faiths and traditions and kind of mixing them together and just enjoying this fruit salad of faiths,
Yeah.
And I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying, but you know what I mean? It's kind of,
no, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
It's which is basically what New Age spirituality kind of is, right? So, but the issue with that then, I think, is that there's also kind of no structure, because it's taking like the experiential elements from all of these, but it's not really recognizing the fact that within those faiths, there are fences and there are boundaries and there are borders. And so the practice is always happening within that fence and within that border. And when you don't have anything, and I don't mean fence or border in terms of like restriction, I mean it more in terms of like a limitation that liberates, right? So I often talk about the Sphirot and the idea in the Tree of Life of Hesed and having to pass through Gevurah. And I think your audience understands that terminology. Hesed, which is just like divine unrestricted flow, but it has to pass through Gevurah and Tiferet, and Gevurah is limitation. It's limitation that's restricted flow, like so that it can express itself properly. And my favorite illustration I've ever heard a Kabbalistic rabbi use is that of playing the guitar. Like if you just strum the open strings of E, A, D, G, B, E, it's discordant. You can't write a song like that. But if you limit the oscillation of the strings by applying, a chord, then you can make music. And so it's a limitation that liberates the instrument to be what it is. So every faith or religious expression does have those constraints. It does. And they don't necessarily have to be seen as bad, but if you come from a more fundamentalist background, you automatically think constraints, structure equals bad.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I think when we come, because we're often coming from a hyper-structured viewpoint, we then enter into that space, and it's just sort of a free-for-all, grab bag of experiences and ideas and practices, all of which have their merits. But then there isn't a practice to really go with it, really, like a more overarching practice. There's not like a logos is what I would call it. There's not a skeletal structure that really kind of binds it together. And so kind of it's everything, everywhere, all at once, which can be fun when you're used to nothing, nowhere, like never, But then after a while, everything everywhere all at once becomes almost as meaningless as nothing nowhere never. Like because it's so spread out, you also kind of lose the experience of it, I think. And that's just my experience.
No, I love that. I want to pick up on it with that. It's funny that you went into Kabbalah, because when you were talking, I was thinking about Kabbalah as an example, where you have the philosophical side, which I think is really important, that maybe gives more structure to it, right? Then you have the practical side, which is the more, occultic, magical, or ascending practice of it. So I think it's interesting that you went there. And then something else you said that really struck a chord with me was about Protestantism. And you brought this up when I was on with your program the last time. But something I just thought about. So is deconstruction. So how much of that seed or that blueprint or that logos of protestation got into us? And so that our deconstruction perhaps is also some kind of an expression of that protestation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we free ourselves from that?
Yeah.
Would be the first thing. And I want you to come back and answer that. But something else, you really articulated something I said last week. For me, a lot of New Age stuff is what I call spiritual tourism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of practices that people do now in the West, Kundalini yoga, working with the chakras, any kind of, Zen meditation or anything like that, is for the most part, in my view, disconnected from the Eastern philosophies and stuff, those fences. So
Mm-hmm.
you really articulated that well. And I guess I wonder, is this protesting more of a Western expression? And
Mm-hmm.
did a lot of us deconstruct? Was it just the natural outworking of the next sort of fractal of that Protestant germ or seed that gets inside of us,
Yeah.
Protestant Christianity? What are your thoughts about that?
No, I think that's exactly it. I really, really do. But I think things reach a point in their fractal outgrowth, I don't know, where the next logical step, that is actually the honoring of the previous step, it looks opposite. And that's when things kind of start over, And so one of the things that so I think about it this way. I often say, there's two ways to approach it. Human beings, we created our deities in this way of looking at things because we found ourselves in a world where we detected pattern.
Mm,
And then we're also smart enough to know that we are pattern making creatures. Therefore, if there are pre existing patterns, well, there must be a pre existing pattern maker like us who's just infinitely larger because these patterns are at the very core of reality. So we detect agency through pattern. And well, where does that come from? It can come just from base survivalism of like the old illustration of it. If you assume the breeze in the bushes is a tiger instead of just a breeze, you're more likely to pass on your genes because there's going to be one time you assume it's a tiger, or there's going to be one time, it's not going to be the breeze. It is going to be the tiger, but you assumed it was a tiger, so you survived, and the opposite's going to work the opposite way. So those who assume
right.
breezes and bushes are just breezes don't usually live to pass on their genes because one time they get it wrong, and that one time they get it wrong is the one chance they have of getting it wrong. Those who assume agency, where it might just be wind in the trees, live to pass on their genes. So we have that agency detection kind of baked into us from evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So now we can, pareidolia, we look at wood grain, we see eyes, we look at the clouds, we see an image.
Mm-hmm.
That's that structure for detecting pattern that we probably evolved as a way of survival. So now we have these beings that we create as a result of detecting a larger pattern. Eventually they become like uncoupled from us in some way. And
Right.
whereas we were holding the strings to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day balloon that was our God, eventually it kind of becomes uncoupled from us and we're just all under the canopy of this thing following it instead of it following us.
Right.
And so that's one way to think about it. And that gods are just our projections. They're
Mm-hmm.
projections of who we are that eventually we kind of lose control of. Another way of looking at it would be that, well, if there is underlying pattern and reality is fractal, then it would make sense that a patterned being duplicated itself in a world that has pattern baked into it. So one way to think about that then would be to say that, like, okay, and I'm talking about this in terms of, I know I'm going all over the map,
No, it's great. Keep going.
but like in terms of going post Protestant deconstructionism, right? How do we get over that? I don't know that we can get over it. I think
Mhm,
it's something we have to watch and have a governor set on so we can know
mhm,
when we're going there. But I think one of the things, at least for the generation that we're in, one of the things that we are being called to remember the power of is the power of symbol and symbolism.
mhm,
And so that's why post fundamentalism, post atheism, post deconstructionism, I am now comfortable calling myself a Christian again.
mm,
And I don't want to caveat that to death either, because you can caveat an identity or a truth to death. Be like,
right.
well, I'm not that kind of Christian, and I don't mean this by it. I'm kind of a more like, I'm comfortable with this set of terminologies, or this set of terms rather. And if you hang with me long enough, you'll know who I am,
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons I've been able to do that is because I feel like I let the symbols really die. I feel that like I let the thing die.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you have to realize that so sometimes you have to have a projection, which you could call the
Right.
divine, crash, or a projectile rather, crash into your projections from the outside and
Mm-hmm.
show you this Macy's Thanksgiving Day float or balloon that you called God wasn't. It was a projection of you. So something comes down, deflates it, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're like, oh, we created that. Look, there's the Made in China sticker on its back. I mean, oh, that was us. Or and then but then sometimes though, that has to happen
Mm-hmm.
so that whatever the spirit of that thing was, whatever was intended by that symbol, can go airborne and be released again, so that it can then return to us so that we can actually experience it. So sometimes projectiles have to smash into projections, and sometimes projections have to become projectiles again, right? And I think the way that projections become projectiles is that we have to let them die. And that's what the deconstruction process does.
Mm-hmm.
But then it liberates, I think, in some ways, the intention, the
Mm-hmm.
power of what this thing was before, the power of what, the bronze serpent was before it became, the idol in scripture. That's an illustration some might be familiar with. It meant this, but it became this other thing. So, like, we have to sometimes let them die. And that's sometimes the next natural step in evolution, even though it looks like devolution, even though
Right.
it looks like a step back, it's not a step back. It's a purposeful decomposition of a thing because it's become so dense and so heavy and so centralized that we can't actually, now it's just this thing. And we don't know why we're enslaved to it. We don't know why we worship it. We don't know why we follow these principles and ideas. We don't know. So you have it dissolved. It goes all over the place on you. Like you lose it. You can't grasp it. And then you let go of, let's say, the principles that you adhered to while under it. But you didn't know why you adhered to those principles. You just did it blindly because this clump, this mass told you to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But now that you've lost it and you can't find it, you let some of those things go. And then you might start to realize, you know, I guess I never really knew why we did that. But now that I'm not doing it, something feels off. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a spiritual
Yeah.
practice, like prayer, meditation, or
Right.
whatever. Now I've lost the
Right.
system that told me I had to, and so I don't do it anymore. Or, I don't necessarily mean going to church. You don't have to do that, but like, gathering together, even just through mediums like this and having
Right.
meaningful conversations about spiritual things. You stop doing that for a while because you were forced to go to church and it made you hate that. And then all of a sudden you're like, I didn't really know why we did that, but now that we don't do it, something feels off. And then you start to search for the spirit of the
So
thing,
good.
you know what
Yeah.
I mean, that you
Yeah.
lost. And so that's when I think we all kind of go on our quest and we have to rediscover it for ourselves. And so for me, that's why symbolism has become so important because the projection, pardon me, the projection became a projectile. And what once came from me, it went higher and came back down. And now I'm being forced to discover, okay, what was this really all about to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
Because when it became so weighty and dense that it was just this massive stuff that I had to do and obey,
Mm-hmm.
it meant nothing. But now that it's decomposed, if you will, and is airborne, I'm experiencing the spirit of it again. And so that's even, with scripture, the way that I approach the Bible, like I know how to do the historical critical method. I've done this. I know how to read the Bible like that. I know how to look at it from this angle and that angle. And that's great. And when I'm actually studying for like academic reasons, sure, that's how I'll do it. But when I wake up in the morning and I'm drinking my coffee and I crack open, let's say scripture, or I crack open whatever it is, I'm not reading like that. I'm like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what's the heart? What's the spirit of what's being said here? Even if it's not plain, even if the writers themselves didn't maybe mean to say that,
Right.
what's the spirit behind it? And that's the power of symbol. Like our world is filled with symbol systems. And if we can discover the spirit behind the symbol, that gives you both the spirit and the framework, right? It gives you, but the framework is not oppressive because you realize it's symbolic. You realize it's not like a prison you're in. It's more like a playful boundary. Like, it's more like, well, this is where the playground ends, and there's the highway. So like you can play in the highway, but
Right.
probably better, at least in this context, to stay in these bounds. It's basically just teaching you chords on the guitar. It's like, oh, you can bang on E, A, D, G, B, E, and that's fine. Just don't be surprised if no one listens to you, But if you learn just a little skill, you can make music. And so I think it's rediscovering that, but in that non-oppressive way, because we've let the thing die. And so we're not gripping it that tight anymore. And it's an Alan Wattsism, but he said faith is, excuse me, to have faith is to let go and to trust. We think to have faith is to cling on and to white knuckle yourself, into oblivion. But real faith is letting go of whatever debris you're holding onto and letting the river carry you, and trusting that whatever this river is, it's going to take you where you need to go. Like, that's really having faith. And so when my faith started to fall apart on me, there was that point where I'm like, no, hold on, grip tight, don't let it go. But then I was like, why? And one of the things that I got from my dad was, and he was filled with the Holy Spirit at a full gospel businessmen's meeting back in the 70s. And that's actually the way I start off the book I'm writing right now. It's like, my father was filled with the Holy Spirit at a full. That's the line I start with. That's the line that came to me. And so what I wrote with, and the whole thing I'm exploring is that he was in this meeting with these guys. He was a new convert, a truck driver, had never seen anything like this, had never heard anyone prophesy or speak in tongues, but all these guys are just doing it. And he said he was just like, if this is real, there can't possibly be anything more important going on. If this is God, I mean, that was just his thought in that moment. And he was like, so if it's real, I want it, and I'm going to test it out. And he had an experience that changed his life, that changed our family's life, that delivered him from years of, drugs and alcohol and all kinds of stuff. It was a very positive thing. So, and I've seen in my own life where I've taken a path that seems to really diverge from the path he took. In a lot of ways I can put them next to each other and they just really don't map onto one another at all. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that those words that I heard him repeat in sermons dozens of times over the years I thought to myself, if this is real, it's the most important thing going, and I'm going to give myself to it. I realized that was the animating spirit in me that kept me doing the searching that I was doing. That was what kept me going after things the way I went after things. And I realized, it looks very different, but it's the identical path. It really is. It's the same thing. And then, thinking of Difference in Repetition by Deleuze, where everything truly novel appears in the form of a repetition, that sometimes something seems to totally diverge and be different, but it's the same thing in a different context or in even another dimension, if you will. But the rules are just different here now because of how much has changed, but the trajectory is the same, right? And so but all that to say, I even realized the symbolism in the literal experience of my father was the same thing that I was experiencing in my life. And
man, I love that. So this is so helpful, Jeff, because my mind goes back to a book that I read probably 2 decades ago, but it's called The Rebirth of Images by Austin Farrar. And it's a commentary on the book of Revelation. And it was one of the first commentaries that I read that wasn't, dispensational. And his take on the book was that it was structured around, with all the sevens and everything, it was structured around the feast cycle of Israel. And the whole premise of the book is a rebirth of images, is that all these symbols that had a literal meaning to Israel or a literal meaning in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, now in the New Testament, and specifically in the book of Revelation, are being reborn. So it's exactly what you're saying. Those images died. So if we think about it this way, that's exactly what happened with Christianity. All the old covenant symbols died to their original intention and meaning, and then they're rebirthed under this new covenant Christian context where the imagery is still there. You might say the structure is still there. But it takes on completely different meaning. Am I tracking pretty well with what it is that you're trying to say?
No, I think 100%. And that we don't realize that image continues in all that we do. We are all in one way. I can't remember if it's a Girardian term, but somebody who says basically the world is Christ haunted. At least the Western world is Christ haunted. And we don't necessarily realize it because
it's true.
We've tried so hard to move away from it. But the principle of what Christ represents, which is lay your life down in the name of nobility, taking your life back up, that is kind of what's at the heart, or at least in theory, what's at the heart of Western culture and civilization. That is the model we tried to emulate. we're not always that good at it, but that's the basic structure that's there. And so you can see that we live that out even in atheism. You know, when Dawkins and Sam Harris began to talk about, you know, I remember this is one of the things that started to wake me up years ago to be like, we're kind of doing the same thing. Because
Mm,
they then started to talk about how it's all about well-being and the moral landscape, and how it's all about, you know, evolution. If you're good to people, essentially, you're going to be reciprocated for it, and that's why we've evolved morality. And it's like, we're really all kind of saying the same thing, only at the end of the day, there's nothing that helps complete the circuit there other than, well, as Dawkins calls it, the selfish gene. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Which, that's a misleading term, but really symbolically it's kind of also not. It's really just kind of all about, how can I get people to do the most things for me that benefit me? Well, it's by being good to them. But at the center of that, there isn't something transcendent. It still is kind of you know. And so that's the one way in which I think spirituality, even though I think that the same thing might be superior, is that it has an altar of mystery, you know, where it's like, okay, there could be something more here that's calling you, and it can be eternally open to interpretation. Whereas the one that just sinks into the void, well, there's nothing. And when you get to the end of that, that's when you can find yourself nihilistic and being like, well,
Yeah.
why am I doing any of this? You know?
So let me shift gears here. I would love to keep going down this path because
Mhm.
great discussion, very helpful and beneficial, I'm sure, for everyone that's listening. Um, but we have a generation coming up for sure that I think all the statistics show
Mhm.
is not being raised with that Christian symbolism and imagery and doctrine, at least not to the degree that you and I got into it, right? Like, so it makes perfect sense for people like us who, if for no other reason, our subconscious is full of that symbolism and that imagery, to experience that sort of rebirth, right? Or redefining, I would say, of the gospel and the Christian message. That's where I'm finding myself. It's like sort of a redefining of those things, but still using those things and working with those things and appreciating the value of those things. But now we potentially have, you know, from millennials forward, people who may not have that same symbolism, that same imagery, but yet definitely have that same search for meaning or quest for the divine, right? Mm-hmm. So I postulated last week on this show that channeling, I've just noticed in holistic fairs, metaphysical fairs, regardless of the size, that's gaining momentum, that concept. Dr. Stephen Greer, of course, in some of his documentaries, talks about this sort of telepathic communication with, I don't know if alien species is the right terminology or not, because I'm not as well read in that area or around that community as much. But I did read an interesting book by Whitley Strieber, who wrote The Communion, and kind of, in my view anyway, put the whole idea of alien abduction into public consciousness, public awareness. And Jeffrey Kripal, who I think is the chair of the humanities department at Rice University, and he's a doctor in comparative religion. And so Whitley will write a chapter about his experiences, and then Jeffrey will come alongside in the next chapter and look at it from the perspective of comparative religion. And one of the things that they postulate in that book is that they talk about what they call the UFO mythology, and not mythology in the sense that most people hear that word, but sort of in the Joseph Campbell realm, more or less story might be a better word to use, right?
Right.
So they warn against, they say that it's very possible that the religion of the New Age will be this religion of ufology, aliens, alien contact, things like this. And not only does Whitley say, I don't think these things are from other planets in the way that we think about it. I think they're from other dimensional planes that are coexisting with us. Like, in other words, he's saying, I don't think, if I understood him correctly, I don't think they're coming from the Sirius galaxy or whatever. I think they're coming from another plane or dimension of reality that coexists with ours.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about the future? Because I'm kind of envisioning, and again, I'm not trying to be prophetic. I'm not asking you to be prophetic. I'm just trying to be philosophical, right? And just read the tea leaves and kind of understand the times.
Yeah.
And say, I could definitely see where there is a departure from adherence to ancient paths, ancient texts, ancient scriptures, traditions of our fathers, where this sort of new channeling experience becomes the voice that gives structure and shape and form to a future spirituality, and potentially, as Strieber and Kreipel warn, a religion that could devolve into something that's exactly what you said with the Macy's parade. Right. So what are some of your thoughts about channeling, ufology, and the future of spirituality?
Yeah. I mean, for one, I don't pretend to understand all the dynamics of what happens with channeling. And, of course, if I reverted back to old school charismania, it's just demons and there's no other option. There's no such thing as the subconscious mind. It's not just the person talk. It's got to be demons, of course.
Of course.
But I mean, there's undoubtedly some very powerful cultural shifts that have come about as a result of channeled works and things like this. I mean, there's the Seth material, and what's the book? Jonathan Livingston Seagull came out. The author was inspired to write that as a result. Some really big cultural flashpoints have happened as a result of things gained and gleaned from these. Abraham Hicks, Esther Hicks, whatever. Obviously, there's tons of people who have benefited from the words of this individual or set of individuals, but much in the same way that someone has benefited from the words of a Tony Robbins or things like that, because it's mostly motivational sort of stuff. So certainly, and then there's probably some stuff that gets mixed in there too that's not so great. But I don't pretend to understand all the dynamics of that. But I do know that as one who's come from the world of charismania, I won't call it charismania, that's just insulting, but the charismatic world, and I've done the whole prophetic thing. I also feel like I participated in that practice at times, which I'm sure you have too.
Oh,
that moment when you're just in the throes of, some kind of spiritual ecstasy or just this intense spiritual moment, and you're just kind of given over to something talking through you. And it was never the something grabs your mouth and makes you jabber on, but you feel this flow of intelligence, you feel this flow of revelation coming through you. And, I don't really think it's too much different than that, honestly. And so I've looked back even at some of the times that that's happened to me, and I'm like, well, was that something else coming through me? Or maybe it was just that unlocked and untapped into parts of my own unconscious that I didn't have the confidence to launch into when I was just me. But when I was under the anointing and I was Pastor Jeff, and people were viewing me in a different way, and I stepped into that different role, because it happens even when I preach. Day to day, I'm not preacher Jeff. You know what I mean? I don't talk like that. But when I step into the role of the preacher, I have a different cadence to me, a different gait, even a different way I speak. And you don't want to say it's a stage persona, but in some ways you can't help but it be that. That's just how we are. We do compartmentalize, and we have different things we become in different moments.
For sure. Yeah,
and so, And so there's a moment where when I'm in this mode, I'm confident, you know what I mean? And there's a receptive audience that helps your confidence because they're wanting to receive something. And so maybe I can give myself to these deeper parts and intuitions that I wouldn't normally give myself to. And that's why a lot of times it's true. So sometimes I think stuff like that could just be that. However, when we get into that's just my thoughts on the channeling thing, but I could talk on that for a long time because I find that really interesting. I really find that interesting. In a lot of ways, especially having come from the charismatic world. When it comes to a new religion kind of emerging from whether works that come from channeled practitioner or channeling practitioners, or just even the ufological experience, I could definitely see that happening. And again, I could see it happening because we want structure, right? We want structure because if you put kids into an open field and tell them to play, they'll naturally clump together as though there were borders around them, because they want to feel a little bit of safety, even though it's like you're free, man. Well, they don't want that much. That much freedom is the same as not any freedom at all, because it's
Right.
scary. But, if you take this powerful, infinite thing that is God, and you sort of remember, I talked to you when you were on the show a couple weeks ago. I mentioned the whole idea of wanting to talk about the concept of the divine mind and consciousness in terms of alters, like alters, in terms of what someone with dissociative identity disorder has, and alters, altars, is in like a holy place. And so when I look at God, it's like God is the God of Abraham, he's the God of Isaac, he's the God of Jacob, he's the God of these different men's experiences. And God as that is different from God as this, because it's emphasizing different things and different ideas. And so it's almost like the divine mind fractures in some way and becomes an altar in relation to an altar where a person encounters it. And this encounter with God defined their life in this way. And so that's how it expresses itself. So where was I going with that? There was a point to that. Oh, like the need
for structure. You were talking about kids playing and
yeah. So the need for structure, it's like, so when it's just nothing like that, it's too much. So I think the divine God identifies with us in moments, and we experience God in the context of that altar / that altar. And it might look different from age to age and era to era because the times are different. And so it could also very well be the case that, well, we don't live 2,000 years ago. We're not first century, Second Temple Jews. We're 21st century, for the most part, quote unquote, Gentiles, who would be listening to this. And so our experience of the world in terms of an altar and an altar is going to be different than what first century Christians were. Also, we're not, Taoists living whenever. We're not, so like our experience even of these truths may take on more the flavor of where we're at now. And we are in an era where we are looking at the stars. We are thinking about what's out there, consciousness and what's out there. And so it's possible that some of these things could come into play. But I think you mentioned last week some of your issues. I caught it so I could kind of be prepared for where we were going to go this morning. But you talked about the law of one stuff and how a lot of that stuff kind of people went off the rails. And while there might be some good things said, broken clocks, right, twice a day and all that. And I'm not even saying anything's a broken clock, but just like, but when you look at how it played itself out, and that's in the people's lives, and that's sometimes where I'm wary of stuff, because there isn't an underlying structure. And so when you try to just throw all structure off and base everything around something that's just totally new and novel, minus the structured past,
it's brilliant.
Well, then you kind of just end up in this place of like, you're like, everything's a social construct. Everything's this, everything that, everything's the other. And it's like, yeah, man, let's just be free. Who cares? Dad, that's just a word. Mom, that's just a word. Husband, wife, that's just a word. And it's like, okay, well, try that out on your child. You know what I mean? It's like, try that out there. Like, you're sure you're right in some way. These are words and mouth sounds we made up, but they represent something deeper. So try that out on the resiliency of your child that you think is so strong. It's not as strong as you think it is. I often say the resiliency of children is often the soft target of the irresponsibility of adults. And sometimes we're just looking for a reason to test that out. And it's like, it's not what you think it is, so just, you can toss off this thing that you say, it's just convention. It's this, that, or the other. But in the real world, the way it manifests is either positive or negative. And so ultimately, I think that's what is symbolized by their fruit, you shall know them. So, and that's why I think when we can get into something that's just totally novel, that's attempting to ditch everything old, you just get all this freedom, but it's scary freedom and it's almost destructive freedom. It's Hesed from the Tree of Life without Gevurah, right? It's just the open guitar without any chords being applied. We think all limitation is bad and it's imprisoning, when it's like, no, sometimes limitation liberates. And it doesn't mean you're constrained, because you can definitely change keys here, a couple runs through the chorus, and you could just change keys indefinitely, right? You can, and you can start an A down here and jump up to where it's in a totally different octave. Like, you can go up infinitely, but you got to move up this, you got to move with the pattern. And so when we remove all the pattern, well, that's where we get into problems. Also, like when it comes to the UFO stuff and mythology, if anyone's not read Jung's book on UFOs, which a lot of people don't know, Carl Jung wrote a book on UFOs.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm actually trying to get permission from Princeton University to
Cool.
republish it right now, because I feel like more people need to know about it, and it's kind of not. But it's called UFOs or Flying Saucers: A Modern Myth of Things Seen in
Interesting.
the
Wow, I
Sky.
did not know that.
And yeah, and he breaks it down to being more, his whole idea is on the mandala being a symbol of wholeness, and he kind of talks about the UFO as almost being the modern version of the alchemists' projection of the unconscious into their beakers and whatever, and like they projected the process of transformation into this
Yeah.
alchemical process, whereas now we're projecting it up. And so he kind of looks at it from that angle. And when I speak in that community, and I'm not dogmatic about whether something is from yonder star or another dimension or
Right.
from in here. All I know is the phenomenon
Mhm.
is real. Obviously,
Yeah,
there's a
right.
phenomenon. Don't know what it is. My idea is that the disc is the most enduring image, even though there's all kinds of images of the
Right.
UFO we have, right? But the disc is the most enduring, right? Even though it's not the most commonly seen. Well, why is it? I think it's a
Mm.
symbol of wholeness. And if you look back to where the UFO whole thing started off in America, if someone wants to read, now we're really getting
No, it's
off, but I
great,
hope it's
man. It's
okay,
good
Aaron.
stuff.
Yeah. If someone reads Jacques Vallée, it's one of his newer works from a few years back called Trinity. I think it's called Trinity, the Missing Key or something like that, where he talks about one of the first, what kicked off the modern UFO experience was a crash that happened just several weeks after the detonation of the atomic bomb at the Trinity site in Los Alamos, which was just, dramatized in the movie
Mhm.
Oppenheimer last summer. And that field was called Trinity. And Oppenheimer himself said he wasn't exactly sure why, except that he was meditating on the poetry of John Donne, right? Metaphysical poet John Donne, a poem specifically called "Batter My Heart, Three-Person God," where he
Okay.
talks about the Trinity, and he basically says it's basically a prayer where he says, um, I'm very hard of hearing, very dense. So get my attention in whatever way you need to get my attention. And so
Hmm.
one of the ways I often symbolize this is that there we split the atom. Splitting the atom represents tearing apart the heart of reality, the most central fractal thing, which is this union, right? So when you tear that union apart, what do you get? You get that. It happened at Trinity. Now, from a Christian symbological viewpoint, Trinity is the fractal pattern of reality. And Trinity, the Father's called perichoresis, which means to move in a circle. So it's three persons who are different, but that are one. So we split the heart of reality at Trinity Field. It almost goes up as this prayer, symbolically
Mm.
speaking. And what happens a couple weeks later, right by the field, is the first ever documented UFO crash that starts the modern phenomenon happens. And it's the enduring symbol of the circle that just sort of appears out of the collective unconscious, if you will. It's almost as if this
Mm.
is the answer. Now, what all that means, I don't know, but this is kind of what I often talk about, but that it is this callback to
Mhm.
this wholeness and to this pattern where you've spread everything out, but the call is to come back as something that has exploded, but now is called to come back together after having
Mhm.
lost that cohesion, you know, the post deconstructive experience of that coming back together, where now I'm choosing to walk this way, even though I know I don't have to, you know, and it's not as restrained as it once was because I know I can step outside of the boundaries and I'm
Right.
not going to go to hell. But at the same time, I'm realizing life kind of works in this context, whatever it is, whatever it's Buddhist, Taoist, New Age, Christian, whatever. I've realized it works within this context and I'm choosing it. It's not being forced upon me because I've rediscovered the
Mhm.
spirit of the thing rather than just the dense lump that I once
Right.
just obeyed blindly because it was
Right.
all I knew to do. Um, anyways, that's kind of my
I
take on
love
some
it.
of the UFO and
Love it.
physical
Great
stuff. Yeah.
discussion. So in the comments here, Daryl Carlson, he says, so am I hearing you say that we have to break free from toxic structure / limitations, knowing that the target is a more liberating structure / limitation?
I think that's fair enough. I think that's fair enough. I wouldn't even necessarily know that I'd say it's the
Hmm.
target. I think it's more just kind of the
Hmm.
natural playing out of things and how it'll happen. Like, and that's one of the things that I feared actually in the when deconstruction kind of went more mainstream, not to sound like a hipster, a deconstruction hipster, but when deconstruction more went mainstream, is that I was like, well, there's always a recoil, there's always a recoil when this happens. And so Chesterton called it the thrilling romance of orthodoxy, where you kind of realize the beauty of the structure above the throwing off of everything. And so then there's usually a return to it. Well, there can be a return to it. But in the meantime, I think those of us who have experience with it should do everything we can to sort of fill the airwaves, if you will, with the notion that the return doesn't have to be a return to the identical thing. In fact, it really can't be. It can't be once you've gone through the experience, but you'll try to because you think you have to. But it's like, it's the second naivete that Paul Ricoeur talks about. First naivete, you can't help but be naive the first time around. You're a kid. You don't know anything. You just want to shove food in your mouth, run around. You don't know. You're naive. You experience childhood the first time around unconsciously. You're just there. You become an adolescent. You start to realize things. You question your parents. You question the rules. You question the conventions. You lose that. You become a rebel. You're a teenager. F the system, whatever. You meet a girl, you meet a guy, you have a kid, and you start to realize, maybe I need to get some of that back because the way I'm living right now isn't conducive to happiness here. And there's kind of that second naivete you take back on, where you're like, I'm not the kid who just lived under these constraints blindly without questioning them. I know I've questioned them. I kind of know now why they exist, but I also know that they can be cast off, but it just seems in this moment, maybe this is the better game to play. And that works with God too, or anything like that. It's like, you lose it, you go for a season without it, whatever. But then the spirit of it is kind of released. You kind of rediscover the parts and the elements of it that are important. Kind of like if you've ever seen the movie Waterworld, the old Kevin Costner flop that I still love, where the earth is flooded and covered in water, but he dives down to the depths, to these huge cities, and he brings up from the depths of the old world, things that still work in the new world. And, in some ways that's it. The old world has to be flooded so the spirit of it can be released and you can reapply it in the new world. So I don't necessarily know that it's a target you can aim at, but I think it's what we should expect if we go down that path. And I think, in the meantime, like I said, those of us who maybe have been down that path, not to sound like the experienced ones, because I'm not. I'm one book away from another deconstruction experience. I'm one fact I didn't know away from another, total paradigm shift. We all are. But those of us who have been in this one particular form of it, I think should do everything we can to just try to prepare people for that reality, that there will be a return, but the return can't be and doesn't have to be a return to exactly what you left. I call it a longing, a memory of the singularity, a memory of when everything was one, and then you lost it when it all spread out. But that's how creation happens. But then there is that memory that draws everything back into singularity again, so creation can happen again, and that's life. And
I think I would highlight, and I'll let you go here pretty quick, Jeff, because we're coming up on the end of our time. But I think my takeaway from what I'm hearing you say, and the way I would think about it, is there's a difference between a limitation or structure that's imposed upon a person via groupthink. And I think that was the biggest problem. Like, you couldn't deviate too far from the group that you were a part of, or you would be alienated. I often have said that Christianity and religion, the way that I experienced it in the groups that I was with, we said the foundation was love and relationship, when in fact the foundation was belief and groupthink. And so what I mean by that is you could do just about anything and be loved and forgiven and restored, except question the doctrines, except question the groupthink. Then you become a devil. You become an outcast. We have to get you out as quickly as possible. So the degree to which someone's natural personality and authentic self conforms to the groupthink determines the degree of limitation that they're going to feel within that group. So heterosexual, white, cis male, that experience in the church is going to be very different from someone with gender dysphoria or someone with a homosexual orientation or a bisexual orientation, it's going to be very different. My experience is going to be very different from a person of color or from even a woman, right? And so I'm going to have more freedom to operate and express my authentic self within the structure of that groupthink than these individuals over here. They're going to feel more constrained. And so I think it's important to highlight that I do think part of the deconstruction, part of the protestation of it is a liberation of that unique experience of God. Like when you talk about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? I had the altars and the altar, right? So in order for the altar to be an altar, it has to be authentic to what it actually is. That's what I would say.
Absolutely.
But it cannot, you cannot find that in an unconstrained environment without structure. And because of the internet, because we live in a postmodern era, because of really the pluralism of the world in our society now, people can find groups that resonate more with them, that have meaning, where they can find community, they can find structure, they can find a path. I know there are people that the Course in Miracles has radically transformed their lives for the better. I have read the Course in Miracles a couple of times, and I would just soon watch paint dry. Like, that's not to say anything negative about it. It's just to say that it does not resonate with me. That's not to say the principles of it, like forgiveness and some of the principles in there, don't resonate with me. I'm just saying, as a path, as a course of study, as a structure, that's not something that I want to give myself to. I'm far more resonant with the Western mystery traditions, the Kabbalah, the Hermetic, the Hermetica, things like that. So I think that's how I'm processing this. Like, for a lot of us, when we hear constraint or we hear limitation, it's the constraint and limitation of groupthink that's imposed upon us from the outside in. And what I think you're saying is that explodes. The projectile comes into the projection and blows it up, right? Funny that we're doing this a couple days after the 4th of July. Blows it up for the purpose of liberating that unique expression of the divine that you are. But that also has to have that formative element of structure, which is limitation, but it's a totally different kind of limitation that liberates you to your authentic self, rather than prevents you from expressing your authentic self.
Exactly. No, and I would agree with you. That's a great condensing of my own very much not all that condensed thoughts. And again, that's why I say the guitar for me is just such a great illustration. It's like, if you just heard someone banging on it, you might not even be able to tell what it was you were hearing because of the discordancy and the way it was being played. But there's a way that it was made to be played. And so you liberate it through constraint. That constraint and liberation go together. And you're not actually constraining the guitar. You're letting it be free to be whatever it wants to be. And so, like I said, too, let's say you're playing in the key of E. Well, there are certain notes that go in that key. E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, whatever. Well, and you're like, well, I'm constrained to the key of E. It's like, no, because you can jump up. You can play in the key of G, you can play C, D, A. You can play in all the different keys, you know? It's just that notes go together in certain ways, and there's all different styles. You can throw it, there's jazz that doesn't make sense the same way that, like, folk music might make sense to us. You can throw things in. Everybody's expression is going to be a little different, but still the constraint is what liberates you to discover those things, right? You can find, oh, I can put this chord with that chord, even though it doesn't make traditional sense, but it's the limiting of the oscillation of the strings that liberates you to discover that. And so systems of faith, again, as you said, they're impressed on us through groupthink at the start, but that is probably a corruption and a perversion of what may have once been a pure desire to help people discover themselves. Then over time it breaks down, you lose the meaning, and so all you're left with is the structure as opposed to what the spirit of the structure was. So see the structure itself as a symbol, and symbols and icons are packed with meaning. And if, you know, an icon on your desktop, if you leave it unclicked on, you can make all kinds of assumptions about what it is. The Google Chrome icon on my desktop, oh, it's blue, yellow, whatever, and I can make all kinds of assumptions about what it means without ever actually clicking on it. But if I click on it, the world opens up to me, you know, but it does so in the confines of that app, right? So it's not constraint in the negative sense at all. It's a constraint that will take form and shape around your life and your experience, as you said, depending on who you are, what your, you know, what life is for you. It'll shape itself around you in a certain way, but it'll still allow you to play a song, right, and discover how you're meant to be played and what music and what song you're meant to play, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Jeff, I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you for giving up some time on your Sunday morning away from your family and everything to do this. Brilliant conversation. I always grow and am edified when we get the chance to interact and I get a chance to learn from you. Every time we talk, I learn something. So let people know how they can get your books, find you on YouTube or the internet or your Patreon page. Give us some of that information.
Yeah. Okay. So you can find me on Facebook. That's honestly probably the best way to connect with me because I try to be active on all the other socials, but Facebook is still, it's the 42-year-old in me that's hanging on to Facebook, I suppose. But if you look up Jeff Turner on Facebook, I can even, you know, I'll comment on this or you can tag me in it if you want. You can just find me through there as well. Pretty much anything I'm doing, I'm going to post there. I have 2 books. My first one is called Saints in the Arms of a Happy God, which is sort of a theological deconstruction of what's packed into the word sinners in the hands of an angry God. And that came out about 10 years ago, last April. And then I have another one that's called The Atheistic Theist, Why There Is No God and You Should Follow Him. And that's basically my journey through atheism, through kind of rediscovering something else on the other side. That's available on, they're both available on Amazon. They're both available in audio now as well. So just search Jeff Turner. You can search Jeff Turner Atheism or Atheistic. You'll get my book. You can search Jeff Turner and just put in the word saints and you'll get the first book. Let's see. I do also have a podcast called Religionless. Aaron's going to be on it. We already did the interview for it. It just hasn't launched season 2 of it yet, but that'll be coming out soon. Season 1 of it's already out. We've had great guests on, like my friend Andrea Perrin. We've had more theological thinkers on. We've had people like Mitch Horowitz on. So there's a great collection of shows to listen to there. And I do have a Patreon. If for whatever reason you wanted to get more exclusive content and maybe help us support what we do a little bit, don't feel pressure to do it. But that exists as well. It's patreon.com/religionless. So religionless.
So where do they find the podcast?
Yeah, the podcast's on everything. So it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all those. Just search Jeff Turner Religionless. That's the best way to find it. Yep. Oh yeah, and Friday nights live 9 to 10 every Friday night. I have my show I do with Andrea Perrin, which we talked about at the beginning, called Soul School Sojourn. So you can check that out as well.
All right. And how do they find that?
How do they on YouTube?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. All right. It's broadcast on KGRA radio. And then it's also live streamed on YouTube. We don't publicize the YouTube link as much because I kind of want people to go the website route, but you can get it there as well. But if you go to kgradb.com, you can find that as well as an archive of thousands of other shows. But Aaron, thanks so much for having me on, man. This was a blast. Really enlightening and really enjoyable.
Yeah, it was amazing. Thank you for agreeing to do it. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and we'll have to have you on again, man. I'm sure people just loved it. So thanks again. Appreciate you, man.
Thank you.